The shuttle descended through thick gray clouds toward the surface of Tempest 7. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, 23 beings from across the galaxy sat in nervous silence. Each one had traveled here for the same reason. They wanted to pass the most difficult survival test in known space. Hyun pressed his face against the small window and watched the planet grow larger below them. Dark storms covered most of the surface like angry scars. Lightning flickered between the clouds in patterns that reminded him of the monsoons back on Earth. He had studied this planet for months, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. The storms here never stopped. They just moved from place to place like giant living things. "First time seeing Tempest 7, asked the being sitting next to him. She had blue skin and silver hair that moved like it was underwater. Her name was Nari, and she came from the Zephyr system where people could fly through the air using natural wind currents." "Yes," Hyun replied. "But I have read about it. The storms can reach wind speeds of 300 kilometers per hour. The lightning strikes every few seconds during peak intensity, and the rain can flood the test zone completely." Nari made a sound that might have been laughter. "You humans are so focused on numbers and measurements. Do you think knowing facts will help you when the storm tries to kill you?" "Maybe," Hyun said simply. He went back to looking out the window. Across the aisle sat Tae, a being made of living crystal who could reshape his body to handle different situations. His transparent form caught the light from outside and threw rainbow patterns on the shuttle walls. Tae had passed 17 different survival tests on other worlds. He was here to break his own record. Behind them, Kang took up 2 seats because of his massive size. His people were made of living metal and could survive in almost any environment. He kept muttering that this test was beneath his skills. Every few minutes he would flex his metallic muscles and the shuttle would vibrate slightly. The shuttle pilot announced they were approaching the landing zone. Through the speakers, they could hear the wind howling outside. Even through the thick hull of the spacecraft, the storm sounded like a hungry animal. "Candidates will have exactly 1 hour to survey the test zone before the storm simulation begins," the pilot continued. "You may gather any materials you find, but you cannot bring anything from outside the designated area. The test will last 72 hours. Rescue teams will extract any candidate who activates their emergency beacon, but activation means automatic failure." Hyun checked his emergency beacon one more time. It was a small red device attached to his belt. One press of the button would bring a rescue team within minutes. But pressing it would also end his dream of joining the Galactic Academy. The shuttle touched down with a heavy thud. Through the windows, Hyun could see the test zone spreading out before them. It looked like a battlefield. Pieces of metal and plastic were scattered across a flat area about 2 kilometers wide. Old concrete structures stood at random angles like broken teeth. In the distance, dark clouds were building into the towering wall of the approaching storm. The exit ramp lowered, and immediately the wind tried to push its way into the shuttle. Even though the main storm was still hours away, the air already felt dangerous. It carried the smell of ozone and wet metal. One by one, the candidates stepped out onto the planet's surface. Hyun felt the ground shake slightly under his feet. The wind pulled at his clothes and made his eyes water. Around him, other beings were already moving toward different parts of the test zone. Most of them headed straight for the concrete structures. Those buildings were damaged, but they still offered some protection from wind and rain. Tae walked toward a pile of metal beams where he could build a crystal shell around himself. Kang stomped toward what looked like an old vehicle that he could turn into a shelter using his metal-shaping abilities. Hyun stood still for several minutes, just watching and listening. The wind patterns here were complex. Air currents bounced off the scattered debris and created small whirlwinds that danced across the open ground. The approaching storm was still, far away, but he could feel its pull in the way the wind moved. Su-bin, the human medical officer who was here to observe the test, walked up beside him. She was older than Hyun and had kind eyes that seemed worried. "The other candidates are already gathering materials," she said quietly. "Are you planning To find shelter, I am studying the environment first, Hyun replied. He pointed toward the scattered debris. Look at how the wind moves around those metal sheets, and see how the water pools in those low areas. The storm will change everything, but the basic patterns will remain. Subin followed his gaze, but she still looked concerned. Hyun, this test has killed candidates before. The examining committee expects you to take it seriously. I am taking it seriously, he said. But seriously does not always mean the same thing for everyone. He began walking toward a section of debris that most other candidates had ignored. Here, long strips of synthetic fabric were tangled around broken support beams. Sheets of lightweight metal lay scattered like playing cards thrown by a giant hand. Coils of strong rope hung from damaged structures, while other candidates focused on finding the strongest materials to build the most solid shelters. Hyun examined each piece of debris carefully. He tested the flexibility of metal sheets. He checked the strength of rope fibers. He held pieces of fabric up to the wind to see how they moved. The other candidates began to notice his strange behavior. A group of them stopped working to watch him collect materials that seemed useless for building a shelter. Some of them pointed and made comments to each other in languages Hyun did not understand. Nari flew over to where he was working. Her people could hover in the air using small wind currents, so she moved without touching the ground. "What are you building?" she asked. "Those materials are too light to make a good shelter. The storm will tear apart anything that is not strongly anchored." Hyun looked up at her while continuing to sort through the debris. "Who says I am building a shelter? What else would you build for a survival test? Something that works with the storm instead of against it." Nari tilted her head in confusion. Her silver hair swirled around her face. "That makes no sense. The storm is the enemy. The goal is to survive it by protecting yourself from it." "Maybe," Hyun said. He found a long piece of flexible metal that curved in a way that reminded him of a ship's hull. Or maybe the goal is just to survive. In the distance, the storm was growing larger. Dark clouds rose up like a mountain range made of water and wind. Lightning flickered inside the cloud wall like trapped fire. The wind was getting stronger, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. Most candidates had found their chosen locations and were busy building or reinforcing their shelters. The concrete structures were popular choices. Several beings were digging holes in the ground to create underground bunkers. Others were stacking heavy debris to make walls. Hyun continued collecting his strange assortment of lightweight materials. As the storm grew closer, he began arranging them in patterns that looked nothing like a traditional shelter. The other candidates stopped watching him and focused on finishing their own preparations. But up in the observation shuttle that hovered safely above the storm, the examining committee was very interested in what the human was doing. The test was about to begin. The storm wall was now clearly visible on the horizon like a moving mountain of dark water and wind. The first hour of preparation time was almost over, and most candidates had chosen their survival strategies. The concrete bunkers were reinforced with metal plates. Underground shelters were covered with heavy debris. Crystal formations glowed softly as Tae shaped them into protective domes. But Hyun was doing something completely different. He had cleared a flat area near the center of the test zone where most candidates had avoided building. The ground here would flood first when the rain came. Other beings shook their heads at his poor choice of location. Some pointed and made jokes in their native languages. The human had arranged his collected materials in a pattern that made no sense to anyone. Watching, long metal strips lay parallel to each other like the ribs of some ancient creature. Flexible sheets were stretched between them and secured with the strong rope he had found. The whole structure was only about 5 meters long and 2 meters wide. Nari landed nearby and folded her wings against her body. The wind was getting too strong for comfortable flying, and she needed to return to her own shelter soon. "Hyun, what is that thing you are building?" she asked. "It looks like it will blow away the moment the storm arrives." Hyun was busy connecting two curved pieces of metal at one end of his structure. He had found a way to make them lock together so they formed a pointed shape. "It is designed to move with the wind and water," he replied without looking up. "Fighting. The storm takes much more energy than working with it." "Working with it," Nari repeated. "The storm will have winds over 300 kilometers per hour. The rain will flood this entire area. How do you work with something that wants to kill you?" "The same way my ancestors worked with storms on Earth," Hyun said. He was now attaching the rope in complex patterns that created a web of support lines. They did not hide from every storm. Sometimes they used the storm's power to go where they needed to go. Nari stared at the strange construction. It was starting to look like something she had seen in historical databases, but she could not remember what. "Your ancestors were crazy," she said. "Maybe," Hyun agreed. "But they survived long enough for me to be here." Across the test zone, Tae had finished building his crystal shelter. The transparent walls caught the strange light from the approaching storm and threw colored patterns on the ground around him. His structure was beautiful and strong. Crystal formations could bend without breaking, and his people had survived on worlds with much worse weather than this. But even Tae was curious about what the human was doing. He had never seen anything like the lightweight construction taking shape in the flood zone. Kang had chosen an old metal container and was reshaping it with his bare hands. His people could change the molecular structure of metal just by touching it. He was turning the container into a perfect sphere that could roll with any impact. The metal was thick enough to stop debris and sealed tight enough to keep out water. "The human has lost his mind," Kang announced loudly so everyone could hear. "Look at him building toys while the rest of us prepare for war against the storm." Several other candidates laughed and agreed. A few species that Hyun did not recognize were pointing at his work and making sounds that seemed like mockery. Only Subin, the human observer, looked worried instead of amused. She walked over to where Hyun was working. He had started attaching the largest piece of fabric to a tall metal pole that he had somehow made to stand upright in the center of his construction. "Hyun," she said quietly, so the other candidates would not hear. "The examining committee is getting concerned. They think you do not understand the danger you are in." "I understand the danger perfectly," Hyun replied. He was adjusting the fabric so it could move freely around the pole. "That is why I am building this." "But what is it?" Subin asked. "It looks like some kind of transportation device, but there is nowhere to go. The test zone is surrounded by cliffs and rough terrain. Even if this thing could move, you would just get trapped somewhere else." Hyun stepped back and looked at his work. The structure was almost complete. The metal ribs curved gracefully from the pointed front to the wider back. The fabric was stretched tight between them, creating a hollow space inside. Ropes and support. Lines held everything together in a pattern that seemed random, but was actually very carefully planned. "It is not designed to go somewhere else," he said. "It is designed to stay alive right here." The wind was getting much stronger now. Small pieces of debris were starting to blow around the test zone. The first heavy raindrops were falling from the dark clouds overhead. Most candidates were making final preparations before retreating into their shelters. Hyun worked faster. He had one more critical piece to install. Using tools he had made from scrap metal, he attached a long, flat piece of wood to the bottom of his construction. This piece could move from side to side and had a specific curved shape that he had spent a long time getting exactly right. The other candidates stopped their own work to watch. Even those who had been making fun of him were now curious. The human's construction was unlike anything they had ever seen, but there was something about its shape that suggested it had a real purpose. "It looks like a boat," someone said in the common galactic language. "A boat," another voice repeated. "But why would anyone build a boat for a survival test?" Hyun heard them talking but did not respond. He was checking all his rope connections and making sure the fabric was properly secured. The wind was trying to catch his construction and tear it apart, but the flexible design bent instead of breaking. Nari flew back over one more time before the wind became too dangerous for flight. Hyun, that really does look like some kind of water vessel. Are you expecting the test zone to flood? Yes, Hyun said simply. But if it floods, everyone will have to activate their emergency beacons. The test will be over. For most people, yes. Nari stared at him. You are planning to survive. In floodwater using that thing, not just survive, Hyun said. He was making final adjustments to the tall pole in the center of his boat. Survive and move and help others if they need it. The Zephyrian woman shook her head in disbelief. Humans really are insane, she said. Then she flew back toward her own shelter as the first lightning bolt struck somewhere in the distance. Thunder rolled across the test zone like the roar of some enormous beast. The storm was almost here, and there was no more time for preparation. Candidates disappeared into their shelters one by one. Heavy metal doors clanged shut. Crystal domes sealed themselves with soft musical sounds. Underground bunkers were covered over with debris, but Hyun remained outside next to his strange boat. He had one final task to complete. The large piece of fabric attached to the tall pole needed to be ready for the wind that was coming. He had designed it to catch and use the storm's power instead of being destroyed by it. In the observation shuttle high above, the examining committee was having an urgent discussion. No candidate had ever attempted anything like this before. The test protocols did not account for someone who planned to use the storm instead of hide from it. Should we intervene? Asked one examiner. The rules say no interference unless a candidate is in immediate mortal danger, replied another. Building a boat in a storm zone might qualify as immediate mortal danger, or it might be brilliant. We will have to wait and see. The storm wall was now only minutes away. The wind was howling like a living thing, and the rain was coming down harder. Lightning was striking every few seconds, and the thunder was continuous. Hyun made one last check of his boat. Everything was ready. The design was based on thousands of years of human experience with storms and rough water. His ancestors had crossed entire oceans in boats not much different from this one. Now he would find out if their knowledge could help him survive the worst weather in the galaxy. The storm was about to hit. The wall of darkness hit the test zone like a giant fist made of wind and water. In seconds, the air filled with flying debris and horizontal rain that felt like tiny bullets against exposed skin. The sound was incredible. It was not just noise, but a physical force that seemed to push against everything in its path. Lightning struck the ground every few seconds, turning the world into a series of bright snapshots separated by crushing darkness. The thunder was so loud and constant that it felt like standing inside a drum while someone beat it with hammers. Hyun pulled the hood of his weathersuit over his head and checked his boat one final time. The wind was already trying to lift the lightweight craft, but the ropes he had anchored to heavy debris were holding it in place. The fabric sail whipped and cracked in the wind, but the flexible design let it bend without tearing. Around the test zone, candidates were sealing themselves into their shelters. The last few stragglers ran for cover as pieces of metal and plastic flew through the air like deadly birds. A sheet of corrugated metal spun past Hyun's head close enough to touch. In her crystal dome, Nari watched through the transparent walls as the human remained outside. The storm was so violent that she could barely see him through the rain and flying debris. His small figure looked impossibly fragile against the fury of Tempest 7. He is going to die, she said to herself, but she could not look away. The rain was coming down so hard now that it sounded like a waterfall landing on the roof of her shelter. Water was already beginning to pool in the low areas of the test zone. Within an hour, she knew the entire area would be underwater. Tay's crystal formation hummed with harmonic frequencies as the wind tried to find weaknesses in its structure. His people had built similar shelters on 100 different worlds. The transparent walls were stronger than steel, but flexible enough to bend with the storm's pressure. He felt safe inside his glowing dome. But like Nari, he found himself watching the human instead of focusing on his own survival. Hyun was doing something incredible. Instead of running from the storm, he was preparing to meet it head-on. The human had climbed into his strange boat and was adjusting the sail with quick, confident movements. Even in the howling wind, his actions looked practiced and sure. Kang had sealed himself inside his metal sphere and was rolling with each gust of wind. His people were nearly indestructible, and he was not worried about surviving the storm. But the sounds coming from outside were unlike anything he had experienced. The wind was so strong that even his heavy metal body was being pushed around like a toy. Through small viewing ports in his sphere, he caught glimpses of the human's boat. The lightweight craft was moving now, lifted by the rising floodwater. Instead of being smashed against the ground, it was floating like it was designed for exactly this situation. The water was rising faster than anyone had expected. Most of the shelters had been built assuming some flooding, but not the complete inundation that was happening now. Concrete bunkers that seemed solid and safe were disappearing under the dark water. Underground shelters were filling up like swimming pools. Emergency beacons began to activate. The first distress signal came from a candidate who had built a shelter in what seemed like high ground. But the storm's rainfall was so intense that even elevated areas were flooding. Through the observation systems, the examining committee could see beings trapped in shelters that were now underwater. Rescue shuttles launched immediately, but the storm made flying extremely dangerous. The wind was strong enough to throw aircraft around like leaves. Lightning strikes could disable electronic systems. The rescue teams would have to wait for brief lulls in the storm to extract candidates safely. Meanwhile, Hyun was discovering that his boat worked even better than he had hoped. The sailboat cut through the churning water with smooth efficiency. The design that had looked so fragile was actually perfectly suited for these conditions. The flexible hull bent with the waves instead of fighting them. The sail caught the violent wind and turned its destructive power into forward motion. But Hyun was not just surviving. He was navigating with purpose. Through the rain and darkness, he had spotted several shelters that were in serious trouble. A group of candidates had built their refuge in a low area that was now completely submerged. Their emergency beacon was flashing underwater, but the rescue shuttles could not reach them safely. Hyun sailed directly toward the distress signal. The candidates trapped inside the flooded shelter could not believe what they were seeing through their emergency viewing ports. A human in a small boat was approaching through water that should have been impossible to navigate. The waves were 3 meters high, and the wind was strong enough to flip most vessels, but the sailboat rode over, each wave like it was dancing with the storm. Hyun had adjusted the sail and rudder to work with the wind patterns instead of against them. When a gust tried to push the boat sideways, he used it to change direction. When a wave tried to swamp the hull, he angled over it and used the water's motion to increase his speed. The trapped candidates activated their emergency communication system. Human vessel, this is Shelter 7. We are taking on water and our emergency beacon is malfunctioning. Can you assist? Hyun's voice came back through the storm static. I can see your beacon. I'm approaching from the east. Prepare for water. Rescue! Water rescue, one of the trapped beings asked. How can you rescue us from water when we are already underwater? You will see, Hyun replied. He brought the sailboat alongside the submerged shelter with a skill that impressed even the examining committee. Using a technique that seemed impossible in such conditions, he managed to hold his position steady despite the wind and waves. The trapped candidates opened their emergency hatch and found themselves looking up at Hyun's boat floating on the surface above them. Water rushed into their shelter, but Hyun had already thrown down rescue lines. One by one, he pulled the drowning candidates up into his boat. The sailboat was designed to carry more weight than it appeared capable of handling. As each new passenger came aboard, Hyun adjusted the sail and balance to accommodate the extra load. The boat continued to ride the waves smoothly, even with 6 beings packed inside. "How is this possible?" asked one of the rescued candidates. She was from a species that lived on desert worlds and had never seen so much water in one place. "This storm should have destroyed any surface vessel." "Not if the vessel is designed correctly," Hyun replied. He was steering toward another emergency beacon that had appeared on his instruments. "My ancestors crossed oceans in storms worse than this one." "Worse than this? Much worse. Earth has hurricanes that last for days and cover areas larger than most planets. This storm is strong, but it is predictable." Through the observation systems, the examining committee watched in amazement as Hyun continued his rescue operations. His boat had become a mobile lifeline for candidates whose shelters had failed. The human was not just surviving the test, he was changing it completely. Nari's crystal dome was holding firm, but she could see that the water level was still rising. Soon, even her elevated shelter might be in danger. She watched Hyun's boat moving through the storm with grace and purpose. That seemed impossible. Tae's crystalline structure was resonating with harmonic frequencies that kept it stable in the churning water. But several stress fractures were beginning to appear in the transparent walls. The storm was stronger than his calculations had predicted. Kang's metal sphere was being tossed around like a ball by the current and wind. He was not in immediate danger, but he was completely helpless. His heavy construction that seemed so strong on land was useless in the water. More emergency beacons were activating as shelters failed one by one. The storm was beyond what most candidates had prepared for. But through it all, one small sailboat continued to dance across the waves, rescuing the drowning and proving that sometimes the best way to fight a storm is to join it. The test was far from over, but already everything had changed. The storm had reached its full power, and the test zone looked like a different world. What had been dry ground 2 hours ago was now a violent sea with waves that crashed against the tops of the tallest structures. Lightning turned the dark water silver every few seconds, and thunder shook everything that was not already moving with the wind. Most candidates were either rescued or trapped in failing shelters. But Hyun continued to sail through the chaos like he had been born in storms. His boat now carried 8 rescued beings from 4 different species. The sailboat was crowded but still moved through the water with smooth control. Each passenger watched in amazement as the human read the wind and waves like they were words in a book he had studied his whole life. "How do you know which way to go?" asked one of the rescued candidates. She came from a world covered in ice, where storms meant blinding snow and freezing wind. She had never imagined that anyone could navigate in conditions like this. "The wind tells me," Hyun replied. He adjusted the sails slightly as a gust tried to push them toward some dangerous debris. "And the waves show me where the deep water is, and the lightning helps me see obstacles before we hit them. But everything is moving and changing every second. How can you predict what will happen next?" "I cannot predict exactly what will happen," Hyun said, "but I can feel the patterns. Wind and water follow rules even when they seem random. Once you understand the rules, you can work with them instead of against them." A new emergency beacon appeared on his instruments. This one was different from the others. It was coming from Tae's crystal dome, and the signal was very weak. Through the rain and spray, Hyun could see the crystal structure in the distance. Beautiful rainbow light still glowed from its walls, but something was wrong. Stress fractures were spreading across the transparent surface like spider webs. The harmonic resonance that kept the dome stable was failing under the storm's incredible pressure. "We need to get to that crystal shelter quickly," Hyun told his passengers. "The being inside is in serious danger." He turned the boat toward Tae's dome and increased speed by adjusting the sail to catch more wind. The sailboat leaped forward, through the churning water like a living thing that wanted to run. Inside the crystal dome, Tae was using all his mental power to keep the structure from collapsing. His people could control crystalline formations with their thoughts, but the storm was stronger than anything he had faced before. Cracks were appearing faster than he could repair them. Water was starting to seep through the fractures. Soon, the dome would shatter completely, and the rushing water would crush him before he could escape. Through the failing walls, he saw Hyun's sailboat approaching. The human was sailing directly toward the dome, even though the crystal structure could collapse at any moment and sink the boat with it. "Human vessel, this is Tae," he transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Do not approach. My shelter is unstable and dangerous. Save yourself." "Negative," Hyun replied. "I am coming alongside. Prepare for immediate evacuation." "You do not understand. When this dome fails, it will create a whirlpool effect that could sink your boat and kill everyone aboard." "I understand perfectly," Hyun said. "That is why we need to move fast." The sailboat reached the crystal dome just as the largest cracks began to spread across its surface. Hyun brought his boat so close to the failing structure that his passengers could touch the rainbow walls. "Everyone hold on. Tight," he told them. "This is going to be rough." Tae opened the emergency hatch in his dome, and immediately water began pouring in. The crystal structure groaned and sang with harmonic frequencies as it fought to stay intact for a few more seconds. Hyun reached down and grabbed Tae's crystalline hand just as the dome exploded into 1,000 glittering pieces. The implosion created exactly the whirlpool effect that Tae had warned about. Water rushed inward from all directions, trying to fill the space where the crystal shelter had been. The suction was strong enough to pull down debris the size of vehicles, but Hyun had been ready for this. The moment he pulled Tae into the boat, he had already adjusted the sail and rudder to use the whirlpool's rotation as extra power. Instead of being sucked down, the sailboat spiraled outward from the collapsing dome like it was riding on invisible rails. The passengers screamed as they spun around the edge of the whirlpool, but Hyun kept perfect control. The boat's design let it ride the circular current until they reached calm water beyond the danger zone. "Impossible," Tae gasped as he found a place to sit among the other rescued beings. "You used the whirlpool to escape from the whirlpool. Humans have been sailing out of whirlpools for thousands of years," Hyun replied calmly. "The trick is to understand that circular motion wants to throw things outward. You just have to position yourself correctly." Another emergency beacon activated, across the test zone. This one was from Kang's metal sphere, which was being tossed around by the current like a giant ball. The heavy construction that had seemed so strong was now completely out of control. Hyun sailed toward the signal and found Kang's sphere spinning wildly in the current between two concrete structures. The metal ball was banging against the buildings, with impacts that sent shockwaves through the water. Inside, Kang was probably being thrown around like contents in a shaken container. "Kang, can you hear me?" Hyun transmitted. "This is the human vessel. I am here to assist." "Human," came Kang's voice through heavy static. "My sphere is trapped in a current loop. I cannot break free and the impacts are damaging my shell. But there is no way for you to help. Your boat is too small to tow my sphere and too light to break the current pattern." "I am not going to tow you," Hyun replied. "I am going to change the current." "Change the current? How is that possible?" Hyun studied the water flow around the concrete structures. The current was bouncing back and forth between the buildings, creating a trap that held Kang's sphere in constant motion. But water currents could be redirected if you knew where to apply pressure. He sailed to a position upstream from the trapped sphere and deployed something that none of his passengers had seen before. From inside the boat's hull, he pulled out a large piece of fabric attached to strong ropes. "What is that?" asked one of the rescued candidates. "A sea anchor," Hyun replied. "It creates drag underwater to change how the boat moves. But if you use it correctly, it can also change how the water moves." He threw the sea anchor into the current at precisely the right angle. The fabric filled with water and created resistance that changed the flow pattern between the concrete structures. The current that had been bouncing back and forth now had a new path to follow. Kang's sphere immediately broke free from the current loop and began drifting toward calmer water. Incredible, Kang transmitted as Hyun brought the sailboat alongside. The metal sphere. You redirected an entire water current using a piece of cloth. Water wants to flow, Hyun replied. Sometimes it just needs to be shown a better path. He helped Kang transfer from the sphere to the sailboat. The metal being was much heavier than the other passengers, but the boat's design compensated for the extra weight by adjusting its balance automatically. Now the sailboat carried 10 rescued beings from 6 different species. It should have been overcrowded and unstable, but Hyun continued to sail with the same smooth control as before. "How many more can this boat carry?" asked Nari. Her crystal dome was still holding, but she could see that the water level was continuing to rise. "As many as necessary," Hyun replied. In the observation shuttle high above the storm, the examining committee was having an emergency meeting. What they were witnessing had never happened before in the history of survival testing. "The human has rescued more candidates than our official rescue teams," reported one examiner. "His success rate is 100%, and he has not activated a single emergency protocol. More importantly," added another examiner, "he is not just surviving the test conditions, he is controlling them. That boat is treating this storm like normal weather." "Should we end the test early?" asked the chief examiner. "The human has clearly demonstrated superior survival capabilities." "No," came the reply. "Let us see how far human ingenuity can go. This storm still has 12 hours remaining, and there may be more surprises ahead." Through the chaos of wind and lightning, Hyun's sailboat continued to move across the flooded test zone like it owned the water. The storm that was supposed to test survival skills had become a demonstration of human mastery over the forces of nature. But the test was not over yet, and the worst weather was still coming. The storm had been raging for 18 hours and showed no signs of weakening. If anything, the wind seemed to be getting stronger and the lightning more frequent. But Hyun's sailboat continued to move through the chaos like it was designed specifically for these conditions. The boat now carried 12 rescued beings from 8 different species. What had started as a survival test had become the largest water rescue operation in Galactic Academy history. And it was being carried out by one human in a boat he had built from debris. Subin watched from the observation shuttle with a mixture of pride and amazement. She had known that humans were resourceful, but what Hyun was doing went beyond anything she had imagined possible. "How did he learn to sail like that?" asked one of the examining committee members. "His skill level suggests decades of experience, but he is only 22 years old. Human children learn to sail before they can walk properly on many parts of Earth," Subin explained. "We have been building boats for over 10,000 years. Every technique he is using was developed by humans who faced storms just as dangerous as this one. But surely no planet has weather as severe as Tempest 7, Subin smiled. "You should see what Earth calls hurricane season." Down in the storm, Hyun was demonstrating sailing techniques that most galactic species had never imagined. He could read wind shifts by watching the spray patterns on the water. He could predict wave formation by feeling vibrations through the boat's hull. He could navigate by lightning because the electrical patterns showed him where different air masses were colliding. "How do you make it look so easy?" asked Tae. The crystal being had been observing every move Hyun made and trying to understand the principles involved. "You are operating in 3-dimensional fluid dynamics with constantly changing variables. The computational requirements should be impossible for organic intelligence." "I am not computing anything," Hyun replied. He was adjusting the sail to catch a wind shift that would take them toward another emergency beacon. "I am feeling the water and wind and responding to what they tell me. Humans learn this the same way we learn to walk or breathe. It becomes instinct." "Instinct," Tae repeated. You mean unconscious processing of environmental data. I mean knowing without thinking. Like how you know which way is up even with your eyes closed. The newest distress signal was coming from Nari's position. Her crystal dome had been holding steady for most of the storm, but the rising water level was finally threatening even her. Elevated shelter. Nari, this is Hyun. I can see your beacon. Are you in immediate danger? Not yet. Her voice came back through the storm interference. But the water is almost at my dome's base. If it rises much more, the current will destabilize my foundation. I am sailing to your position now. Prepare for evacuation. Hyun, wait. I need to tell you something first. What is it? I owe you an apology. When you started building that boat, I thought humans were just too primitive to understand modern survival techniques. I was wrong. What you are doing is not primitive at all. It is advanced beyond anything we learned in the academy. Hyun brought the sailboat alongside Nari's crystal dome as the water level reached the base of her shelter. She opened the emergency hatch and stepped directly into the boat without getting wet. Your people can fly, Hyun said as she found a place among the other passengers. Did you never think about sailing? Flying and sailing use completely different principles, Nari replied. My people control air currents, but we never learned to work with water currents. We always saw water as the enemy of flight. Water and air are both fluids, Hyun said. They follow similar rules. The difference is that water is heavier, so it has more power, but also more momentum. Once you understand that, sailing becomes like flying in slow motion. The boat was getting very crowded now, but everyone was impressed by how stable it remained. Hyun had designed the hull with multiple balance points that automatically adjusted to changes in weight distribution. How much longer can this storm last? Asked Kang. The metal being was concerned about the other candidates who might still be trapped in failing shelters. According to the test parameters, we have 8 more hours, Hyun replied. But the pattern suggests the worst is over. The wind is starting to shift direction, and the lightning frequency is decreasing. You can predict when the storm will end, not exactly when, but I can see the signs that it is beginning to weaken. The waves are getting longer and the wind gusts are less frequent. These are good indicators. As if responding to his words, the rain began to lessen slightly. It was still falling hard enough to sting exposed skin, but no longer felt like being hit with bullets. There, Hyun pointed toward a section of the test zone where concrete structures were still visible above the water. The flood level is stabilizing. In a few hours, it will start to recede. The examining committee was monitoring every word of the conversation. They had been tracking Hyun's rescue operations and were amazed by the statistics. 13 candidates had activated emergency beacons due to shelter failure. Hyun had rescued 12 of them personally. The 13th had been picked up by an official rescue shuttle during a brief calm period. More importantly, 0 candidates had died or been seriously injured. In previous tests on Tempest 7, the survival rate was usually around 70%. The human has achieved something unprecedented, reported the lead examiner. He has not only survived the most dangerous survival test in the galaxy, he has turned it into a rescue operation with a perfect safety record. What do we do now? Asked another committee member. Our testing protocols do not account for a candidate who exceeds the parameters this dramatically. We watch and learn, came the reply, and we start planning changes to our survival curriculum. While in the storm, Hyun was teaching his passengers basic sailing principles as they waited for the weather to improve. The key is to remember that wind and water are not trying to hurt you, he explained. They are just forces following natural laws. If you understand the laws, you can predict how the forces will behave. But this storm has winds over 300 kilometers per hour, protested one of the rescued candidates. How can that not be dangerous? The speed is not what makes wind dangerous, Hyun replied. What makes it dangerous is fighting against it instead of working with it. A sailboat can use a 300-kilometer wind to travel faster and more efficiently than it could in calm air. That seems impossible. Watch. Hyun adjusted the sail and rudder to catch a strong gust that had just appeared. The boat immediately accelerated across the water, riding up and over a large wave with smooth grace. The passengers felt the boat surge forward with power that seemed to come from nowhere. They were moving faster than should have been possible in such rough conditions, but the ride was smoother than walking on solid ground. Incredible, breathed Tae. You are using the storm's own energy to create stability and speed. Exactly. The stronger the wind, the more power is available. The bigger the waves, the more lift they provide. Everything that seems dangerous becomes helpful if you know how to use it. As the storm continued to weaken, more rescue shuttles were able to operate safely, but they found that their services were not needed. Hyun had already rescued everyone who required assistance. The remaining candidates who had not activated emergency beacons were safe in shelters that had proven strong enough to handle the flooding. They would survive the rest of the test without problems, but none of them had done what Hyun accomplished. While they had hidden from the storm, he had mastered it. While they had endured the test, he had transformed it. The sailboat continued to move across the calming water, carrying its diverse group of passengers. For the first time since the storm began, conversation was possible without shouting over the wind. Hyun asked Subin over the communication system from the observation shuttle. What will you do with the remaining test time? I thought I might teach sailing lessons, Hyun replied. Several of my passengers have expressed interest in learning how this boat works. Sailing lessons. During a survival test, the best time to learn sailing is during a storm. That is when you really understand how water and wind work together. In the observation shuttle, the examining committee looked at each other in amazement. The human was not just surviving their most difficult test. He was using it as a teaching opportunity. The test that was supposed to eliminate weak candidates had become a floating classroom where a human instructor shared thousands of years of maritime knowledge with students from across the galaxy, and there were still 6 hours of storm time remaining. The storm clouds were breaking apart as the 72-hour test period came to an end. Shafts of golden sunlight pierced through the gray sky and turned the floodwater into a mirror that reflected the clearing heavens. The wind had dropped to a gentle breeze that barely rippled the surface. Hyun's sailboat floated peacefully in the center of what had been the test zone. The violent sea that had threatened to destroy everything was now calm enough for small fish to swim in the clear water. It was hard to believe that this serene lake had been a death trap just hours before. The 13 passengers in the boat were no longer just survivors of a disaster. They had become students in the most unusual classroom in galactic history. During the final hours of the storm, Hyun had taught them basic sailing principles that none of their species had ever learned. Nari was at the rudder learning how to feel wind direction through the boat's movement. Her natural flight abilities made her a quick student, and she was already able to make small course corrections without instruction. I never realized that water sailing and air flying used such similar principles, she said as she guided the boat toward a group of concrete structures that were emerging from the receding flood. The way you read air currents through water movement is exactly like how my people read wind patterns through cloud formation. Tae was studying the sail mechanism with the intense focus that his crystalline people brought to all learning experiences. The mathematical relationships are elegant, he observed. Wind pressure, sail angle, hull resistance, and directional force create a system that is self-regulating and self-optimizing. It is not really about mathematics, Hyun replied gently. It is about harmony. The boat, the wind, and the water want to work together. Mathematics can describe what happens, but it cannot create the understanding that makes it work. Kang was learning to read wave patterns by watching how they reflected off solid objects. His people's experience with metalworking gave him an intuitive grasp of how forces transferred through different materials. On my world, we shape metal by understanding how stress flows through crystalline structures, he said. Water waves carry stress in the same way. I can see why humans became so skilled at this. It requires the same kind of thinking we use for advanced metallurgy. The other passengers were practicing knots, learning navigation techniques, and asking questions about sailing concepts that their home worlds had never developed. Each species brought their own perspective to the learning process and found connections to knowledge systems they already possessed. Subin watched from the observation shuttle with tears in her eyes. She had expected Hyun to survive the test, but she had never imagined he would turn it into something beautiful. "The examining committee would like to speak with you," she transmitted to the sailboat. "Of course," Hyun replied. "Should I come up to the shuttle?" "Actually, we are coming down. To you." A few minutes later, the observation shuttle landed on a concrete platform that was now just above the waterline. The examining committee disembarked and walked to the edge where Hyun brought the sailboat alongside. The lead examiner was a tall being with silver skin and multiple eyes that could track different objects simultaneously. She had been testing survival skills for over 200 years and had never seen anything like what had happened during this storm. "Candidate Hyun," she began formally, "you have completed the Tempest 7 survival examination with unprecedented results. Not only did you survive the full 72-hour test period, you also conducted 12 successful rescue operations and maintained a perfect safety record for all participants." "Thank you," Hyun said simply. "However, your methods were so far outside our established parameters that we need to discuss the implications. You did not simply pass this test. You redefined what the test could be." She gestured toward the sailboat and its diverse group of passengers. "Instead of hiding from the storm, you used it as a tool. Instead of focusing on individual survival, you created a system for group safety. Instead of enduring the test, you taught it to others." "I did what seemed logical," Hyun replied. "Humans have been dealing with storms for a very long time. We learned that working with natural forces is usually more effective than fighting against them. Yes, we have been studying human maritime history since the test began. Your species developed sailing technology over 10,000 years ago and have been refining it ever since. This knowledge represents one of the longest continuous technological development programs in known galactic history." The examiner paused and looked at the other committee members before continuing. "We would like to propose several changes to our academy curriculum based on what we have observed. First, we want to add courses in environmental cooperation techniques using human sailing methods as the foundation. Second, we want to revise our survival testing protocols to include group cooperation scenarios rather than focusing only on individual endurance. Third, we would like you to join our faculty as an instructor in advanced survival techniques." Hyun looked surprised. "You want me to teach at the Galactic Academy?" "We want you to teach the galaxy. What you have demonstrated here could revolutionize how every species approaches environmental challenges." Nari spoke up from where she was still practicing with the rudder. "I would like to be his first official student. My people have flight instructors, but we have never had sailing instructors. I think we have been missing something important." "I would also like to study these techniques," added Tae. "Crystal formation requires understanding of stress and pressure dynamics. Sailing appears to use similar principles in fluid environments." Kang nodded agreement. "My people could benefit from learning to work with forces instead of always trying to overpower them." Soon, all 13 passengers were volunteering to become students in a sailing program that did not yet exist. The lead examiner smiled, which was an unusual expression for her species. "It appears we have our first class already, assembled." Over the following months, word of the Tempest 7 incident spread throughout the galaxy. The story of the human who built a sailboat during a survival test and used it to rescue everyone else became legend. Applications to the Galactic Academy increased by 300% as beings from hundreds of worlds requested admission to the new Environmental Cooperation Program. The waiting list for Hyun's sailing courses extended for 5 years. More importantly, the philosophy behind Hyun's approach began to influence other fields. Engineers started designing buildings that worked with natural forces instead of resisting them. Terraforming projects began using existing planetary systems as tools rather than obstacles. Even diplomatic protocols were revised to emphasize cooperation with different cultural patterns rather than imposing uniform standards. The Academy's most difficult survival test had become the foundation for a new way of thinking about challenges and cooperation. But for Hyun, the most satisfying result was much simpler. Every month, he took a new group of students out sailing on the now peaceful waters of Tempest 7. The test zone had been converted into a permanent training facility where beings from across the galaxy could learn to read wind and wave patterns. The concrete structures that had once been emergency shelters were now sailing platforms where students practiced knots and navigation. The debris field that had provided materials for desperate survival attempts was now a teaching collection where instructors demonstrated how to build boats from available resources. And on calm days, when the storms were far away, you could see dozens of small sailboats moving across the water as students from 100 different worlds learned the ancient human art of finding harmony with the forces of nature. The exam had been about surviving a storm, but what came after was about learning to dance with it. The sailboat that had saved 13 lives during one terrible night became the first vessel in a fleet that would teach the galaxy a new way to face the storms that life brings to everyone. And sometimes, on very clear days, you could hear the sound of laughter carrying across the water as beings who had once feared the wind learned to make it sing in their sails.